All right, excellent. Well, I'm joined today on the InsurTech Leadership podcast by William Steenbergen. He is co-founder and CTO of Federato. Welcome, William.
Hi, Joshua. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Josh is fine, by the way. Excited to have you on here. Federato's been, doing some good stuff. And so maybe just like to give a quick thumbnail on the company and kind of how you came to co-found the business.
Sure. Happy to tell you a little bit more. So my background is mainly in AI. I was doing a lot of research in reinforcement learning, a lot of the algorithms that ultimately went into things like ChatGPT and Gemini. And as I was working on that, I met my co-founder, who's funnily enough also named William, and we started learning more and more about what's called the coverage gap, right? So the total amount of economic losses and damages that are not insured. And it turns out that the coverage gap has been increasing exponentially over the last 10, 15 years. And the more questions we started asking about that, the more we just realized that insurance companies today aren't set up well to tackle that. And AI can be a really good solution for that, right? And so we effectively started the only and first AI native platform that fully covers the full policy lifecycle. And so what that really means is that the AI agents in our platform and our platform in general takes submissions all the way from email, right, where they tend to come in through to rating, quoting, binding, issuance, and then full endorsements and renewing, right? And parts of that is just standard sort of policy admin functionality, right? But a lot of that is effectively having AI agents do a lot of those things, interact with the product definition that lives in Federato, and ultimately get to a stage where an underwriter is effectively reviewing what an AI agent did, and really taking it from there, really saving a lot of time, right? And so we're seeing 90% efficiency increases, right, or reduce time to quotes, but also being more aligned to underwriting guidelines, right? So actually quoting, 5 times as many policies that are actually in appetite and are according to underwriting guidelines, because instead of starting from scratch and having to figure that all out, an AI agent has already done a lot of that analysis, and oftentimes with much more detail than a human ever could, right? Going through hundreds of pages of underwriting guidelines and portfolio goals and things like that. And then the underwriter is truly actually reviewing that and then moving it forward. So that's really what we do. We've seen a lot of growth, raised $100 million from Goldman Sachs in November last year, and are really having a pretty exciting future ahead of us.
So did you ever think that you would go from doing reinforcement learning research at Stanford to sitting on a podcast about InsurTech with somebody like me?
Probably not, if I'm being really honest. But I think insurance is one of these things, and I think a lot of people in the industry would agree with me on this, that you kind of fall into it and then you never leave, because you find out how interesting it is and how big of an impact insurance really has in the world, right? And obviously, me being a statistician, it's kind of natural to get into insurance, because I think about insurance a little bit of it's just kind of applied law of large numbers ultimately, right? We definitely fell into it, and spent thousands of hours talking to underwriters to actually really learn and get into that. It's been so much fun, and we see so much impact in this industry, right? There's so much opportunity that we kind of never left.
And so did Will have some insights into the insurance industry, and he kind of brought that piece to it, or how did the focus begin?
Yeah, correct. He did a lot of work in that and a lot of research there. But I think ultimately how we really got started was, so we started in 2020, and this was all mid-COVID, right? And what we did is we were obviously both more sort of engineering focused and research focused. But what we did is actually we locked ourselves up somewhere in the middle of nowhere in Idaho over the summer. And we spent about 5 months just 24/7 talking to underwriters. We were interviewing people, actuaries, executives, underwriters, anyone we could find in insurance. And in those 5 months, we literally spent over 1,000 hours talking to underwriters, right? And that's really where we got to know the industry really, really well. And to the point of which, and I think this is sort of the moment where we started thinking, okay, maybe we should start thinking about a solution, because it was really just trying to define a problem, where the underwriters that we were talking to started asking us, hey, for how long have you guys been underwriters by now, right? And we were like, well, we're not, right? But we were starting to speak like them, right? And they thought we were one of them. And that's the point to which we went, oh, this is really interesting. I think we've learned enough, and we can actually we deserve to start thinking about a solution. And over time, we've brought a lot of insurance expertise within our organization, right? So our COO, Megan, has been in insurance for 30 years, right? And there's lots of, there's a whole industry and name one team with ex-underwriters and ex-chief underwriting officers that are now part of the team. So we found a really good combination of getting a lot of that insurance knowledge and AI and technology knowledge into the company.
Got it. And so did you start focused in certain lines of business, or, how has the platform evolved to where it is today?
Yeah, so we really started mostly in P&C, right? And that's still definitely the core of what we do. But effectively at this point, anything commercial insurance, all the way from sort of small and medium business to large risks and large enterprise policies go through the platform. And so we do things like financial lines, excess, casualty, right? Property, and even workers' comp, general liability, pretty much any commercial line you could possibly imagine. We at this point is live in our platform. We even do surety bonds, which is a little different, but just to speak a little bit about the range of businesses and things that our customers have launched in our platform.
Got it. And is there something that is, there's a number of people who have raised money for, AI native solutions, or ostensibly AI native solutions in insurance. So is there something unique or different about the way you guys are deploying AI within Federato?
Totally. So, I will give you this data point. In the last 20 years, no one has grown to this size, right? And raised the amount of funding that we have, right, in insurance technology. And I think one of the key reasons for that is that we are not trying to replace parts of the underwriting process, right? We're not trying to tack on AI onto an existing process. We're actually re-envisioning about how can we completely change this? Like, what does a actual good insurance and underwriting process looks like? And what we found out is that the only way to do that is you can't build a point solution. Like, you have to actually cover the full policy lifecycle, right? So there's a lot of startups out there that will raise funding and, will provide data, or will have a solution that automatically ingests information from emails and enriches that, right? But when you start talking about actually doing, the policy admin work, doing complicated stuff like out of sequence endorsements, right? And the true full policy lifecycle, there hasn't really been a solution in the market that is actually AI native, right? And the reality is, like, we're going up against what we call the old core, right? So these 6 or 7 companies that have been around for 30 years, right, are sort of the well-known policy admin systems that are clearly not in a position to actually run AI agents through their platform as much as they try to claim that they do. They're just not built for that, right? They're not built in an AI native way where the data and the context and the tools that AI agents need are actually ready for that. So we're going against those. And I think that's the big difference, right? Like, in the last 20 years, no one has stood up and said, we're going to beat the old core, right? And we're going to do it in an AI native way. And I think that's a little different than what what currently a lot of startups are going after, which is more the point solution, sort of tacking on AI to an existing process type approach, right?
Yeah, and so I think there's still different levels of understanding of what AI is or what AI can mean in the industry. You've talked about agents. I'm assuming you talked about intake, so you've got LLMs related to that. There's certain things, I think, just traditional automation, where I'm assuming machine learning still probably does the job pretty well. So, how, like, what is your approach? And maybe you could explain a little bit more of kind of which of those different types of AI underlie Federato's approach.
Yep. Yeah, effectively all of the above, right? So traditional machine learning approaches, more agentic approaches, right? But I think the core thesis, right, and I think clarity that we have is, when you start thinking about AI agents, right, and you start thinking about AI doing things that humans are doing, but doing them better, right, and creating sort of that review process for humans. The way to enable that, really, you need kind of three different components, right? So for an AI agent to be successful, it needs to have an LLM, right, a large language model, and those exist. Like anyone can go and use them. That's not the hard part, right? Like use ChatGPT or use Gemini or use Claude, right? Like it doesn't really matter. Then, and we're not trying to build a better LLM either, right? Then second, there is the context, right? So for an agent to actually execute on something, it needs to have the right context, right, of what it needs to do and what is the data relevant. So that context can be like submission data, right? Like what's the broker writing in their email? What's in the accord form, right? What does the SOV look like? Those sorts of things. But it can also be context about your product definition. What deductibles do we offer? What coverages do we offer, right? It can be context about claims, right? It can be context about quote documents and forms, right? When all of those pieces of context live in different places, for an AI agent to actually interact with that context and make the right decisions is almost impossible, right? And what we're seeing is that because a lot of those old core companies have acquired, I think like collectively they've acquired over 100 companies in the last 20 years, is they are sort of stitched together, and that context doesn't live in a standardized way for AI agents to interact with it, right? And the third thing is the tools, right? So for an AI agent to actually not just provide you information and provide a summary, which you see like is pretty easy, right? Like you just ask something and it will answer you. Like, okay, fine, like it answered me, right? But to actually do something, it needs to be able to interact with tools, right? So actually to be able to generate a quote or to run a rater, right? Or to actually do an endorsement, it needs to be able to interact with the tool. And those tools need to be built in a way that is AI native. It needs to be able to build in a way that an agent can interact with it, right? And I think that is something that is really lacking in sort of this old core approach where, those tools are oftentimes like on-prem endpoints if they're lucky, right? Or very slow. And so if an agent tries to interact with it multiple times, like it doesn't work, right? And so building the tools and building the things that actually allow you to underwrite policies in a way that humans can use them, but agents can also use them is really, really important and really key. And, I think we're the only company that actually is doing that truly across the full policy lifecycle, right?
And so what kind of sort of trade-offs are you making in determining, you've raised a lot of money, but at the same time, money can go fast. And so what kind of trade-offs are you making in terms of allocating time and resources to those different pieces that you described? And historically, obviously, there's things like APIs and common standards and things like that. And like, do you need to define new common standards, or is sort of the broader work that some of the core horizontal AI companies are doing kind of setting those standards for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of those standards exist but aren't really tailored for insurance specific functions, right? And insurance is pretty complex, right? Just when you start thinking about an out of sequence endorsement, like that is not something that like exists anywhere else. Like that's so insurance specific that like you need to build that tool, and like we need to natively build that tool, right? For an AI agent to interact with, right? And so a lot of our time is, because we're only serve insurance, goes into like actually building the like truly insurance specific tools, and really you know, a lot of our IP sits in like, okay, when we have all that context, how do we get that to interact appropriately with an AI agent, right? That is fully focused on just insurance, right? And that's something that, like, yes, there are standards, but you have to adapt those standards to something that actually works in insurance, and that's where that comes in. I think you asked about trade-offs. You know, one of the big things I think we've decided last year was, you know, early on as a company, right, and as a growing startup, you know, we would sort of sign deals where our customers wouldn't necessarily be fully convinced of, or would be fully subscribed to this philosophy of like doing the full policy lifecycle in an AI native way, right? And they would basically use Federato as an underwriting workbench on top of a policy admin system, right? And today, those are probably some of our unhappiest customers, right? Because you know, ultimately, like, and they're not that unhappy, right? But ultimately, like, what's happening is they get this experience, but then the AI agent like isn't really able to be successful because it needs to integrate with some on-prem legacy, you know, guidewire installation, right? And it's just not able to do that, right? Because the context isn't there. And so the experience in Federato then becomes, you know, not optimal, right? And so what we've basically said is, look, like, if you're not subscribed to doing the full policy lifecycle in Federato and actually replacing your policy admin system, you're probably not the right customer for us. And you know, the good news is that we have the luxury of saying that, and you know, we have the proof points to explain to people that you know, that sort of bolt-on type solution really doesn't work, right? And we have enough opportunity and growth that we can actually say no to prospects, right? But and to be honest, like, we have to, right? Because from my perspective, like, the risk of doing an implementation poorly is much, and having a reputational hit is much bigger than not signing that prospect at all.
Yeah.
Right. And so we are sort of, I wouldn't say picky, but you know, we do want to do business with people in insurance who actually understand that you can't just bolt on AI and expect it to go well, right? And I think that's sort of the reality. And I think that the wake up call, I think people need to have a little bit, because people have tried and generally failed, right? And you see all those numbers. Like, I was reading a McKinsey report the other day about just how much value is kind of is broken, right, or is lost, and how much money is spent on projects that fail related to AI, and it's generally because people try to bolt it on.
Yeah, right? Yeah. So across the policy lifecycle, like you brought up the endorsements issue, but does that mean you use like some combination of SLMs and LLMs, and SLMs for certain problems, or I don't know how much you're comfortable getting into that, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about it a little bit on a high level, right? Because I don't think this is necessarily rocket science, but overall, the way I think about it generally is this: there's kind of this supervisor model, right? There's a supervisor agent who ultimately has the job of create a quote for this policy, right? And to do that, it needs to interact with effectively sub-agents, right? That can access tools, have their own context window, and et cetera, right? And all of those sub-agents are very specialized, right? And are powered by different LLMs, right? And maybe smaller LLMs. But depending on their task, right, have specific tools and context windows that are very relevant to just that task, right? And ultimately, like, the supervisor agent is responsible for orchestrating that process and ultimately calling the right subagents to get to ultimately a quote, right? But you can probably imagine, like, we have a subagent to do rating. We have a subagent to do generating a quote doc. We have a subagent to do web research, to go out on the web and look at information there, right? We have a subagent that looks at underwriting guidelines. Like, I can keep going, right? But ultimately, that's the way this generally works.
Got it. And so flipping around to sort of the user experience, like could you give a couple of examples of, you know, what different users across the policy life cycle might experience using the platform, and how it's different from the way they've operated, or maybe the same but just better?
Yeah, no, it's fundamentally different, right? And I think that's kind of the point. It's like we're trying to use AI not to sort of replace the process with AI, but actually to change the process, right? And to tell you a little bit more about that process, right? When our customers get an email submission, 10 minutes later, a underwriter logs in, and without having done anything, they look at that submission and it's been quoted, right? They could see the quote. They could press the button send to broker immediately if they wanted to, right? On top of that, they can read the reasoning of an AI agent, what it did, right? What's the information on the web that it found that is relevant? What are the underwriting guidelines that are applicable? What are the assumptions it made in terms of coverages and deductibles based on the accord forms or information that's on the body of the email, right? All those things with clear citations and clear pointers to say, hey, this is where I found this. This is where the document, right? We've clearly like striking the element of the document I've used to just describe the underwriter, hey, this is how I got there, right? Now, it doesn't stop there. If an underwriter wants to change some of this or wants to ask questions, they can just type a question. They can ask the agent, why did you make this choice, right? What, like, if I wanted to get this below 30K, right, a premium, should I be changing the deductible or should I be changing the scheduled credit, right? And then it will answer you to actually tell you, hey, this is the guideline that stated if this business exists for less than 5 years, you should be applying a debit for, you know, the experience, right? And so those are the sorts of things that our underwriters are doing and interacting with. And importantly, if they want to make a change, of course they could go and click in and just click on a drop down and like click a different deductible and regenerate that or re-rate it and quote it. They could also go and say, hey, agent, right, generate me a new quote using the deductible, right, that is below 30K. And you just type it out, right? And that agent will go and do its thing and will actually change the deductible and regenerate another quote. And they can now read that reasoning again, right? But it's all text-based, right? It's chat-based. And you can always go back in and not go chat-based, right? But you have the ability to go and do that way. And, you know, that holds for any part of the process, right? If you want to go and do an out-of-sequence endorsement, you can just go and do it like, okay, hey, I want to change this building. You do an out-of-sequence endorsement. It stages it. You still have to confirm it, right? You have to review it and say, yep, this looks good. Confirm it. But that's effectively how it works. And why this works so well is because insurance is actually very used to this process. Because if you look at the reasoning of this AI agent, it is exactly like a referral, right? And underwriters know the referral process. It's just a referral. You're just like looking at a referral from an AI agent instead of looking at the referral from a human, but it's nothing different, right? So we're actually very used to this process already, right?
So what is your take on some of the AI regulation, the third-party AI rules? I've seen some language suggesting that, you know, at the end of the day, under some legislation potentially, you know, if the AI is deemed to have made a mistake, that there's a human who's going to be held accountable, and you know, who is that human in this scenario?
Yeah, I think in our case, like, unless our customer truly decides to go straight through processing, which is possible, right? But generally people take the step where the underwriter's still reviewing, right? And it's like approving a referral, right? And so if you approved a referral where the inputs are incorrect, like I think ultimately that is on the human, right? And so it just becomes a question of like, how well can we do at presenting this reasoning and helping the human do this review process that is going to determine quality. Now, there's something that really important that I think people need to understand, which is when an AI agent interacts with the rater, it doesn't make up the premium, right? It still runs a deterministic rater, right? Like it still actually runs through your filed rater. It still generates your filed forms, right? The tool that it uses is deterministic, right? And so the only wrong thing that an AI agent can do is send the wrong inputs into some of those tools, right? But given those inputs, everything else is deterministic. And that's not different from a human making a either mistake or a judgment call on the deductible that should be going in or the coverage that should be going in, right? And so ultimately, like what we're seeing is that it's actually like AI agents tend to, in 95% of the cases that we've done, we run a big research study and we found like we had humans do it and then we had our AI agents do it. And like 95% of the time, it was exactly the same. And the other 5%, it was within a certain margin, right? That was lower than the margin if you had 10 humans do the same policy, right? So there was actually less volatility within the agent than there was when you had 10 humans do it, right? Because humans do things differently too. I really, what I'm really saying is like, ultimately, I think we need to sort of ask ourselves, what is the actual baseline we're comparing against?
Yep.
Right? And then what is the stochastic part and what's the deterministic part of this? And as long as the deterministic part is still right, like we're still using our rater, we're still using our filed forms, right? Then like, I really doubt there is a problem there, right? But yeah, this is going to develop. People are trying to figure it out. Like people are clearly learning. I think, to be honest, like a lot of this is very far behind, and there's a lot of education that's needed for people to catch up to this, right? Including some of the legislative bodies. So, I think there's a lot of work to be done, and like we are actually playing a big role in helping those legislative bodies understand that. Like we have lots of actually conversations with those bodies, and to just help them understand how this actually works. Right?
So I think one last question for me, which is, the role kind of forward deployed engineering is a newer term. I think Palantir is the one that popularized it. For those working in insurance who maybe aren't familiar with that or what that means for them in terms of who they interact with or what their customer experience is going to be like, could you share a little bit about that?
Totally, yeah. So this forward deployed engineering role is effectively a model where, and everyone calls it a little differently and treats it a little differently, but effectively it's a model where engineers are sort of ingrained in our customers' organizations, right? So they are, in some cases, they would literally sit in their offices. That's what Palantir does, right? But in a lot of cases, like what it really means is bringing a level of expertise in configuration and engineering power to implementations to ultimately make delivery successful, right? That requires a strong understanding of the platform and where AI is, and that's often the value we provide, right? Because it's not hard to imagine that it's a lot easier for us to hire very strong AI talent, right, and ML talent than it is like for a large multinational carrier, right? And so a lot of that, if we have the ability to provide our customers with that sort of knowledge and provide our customers with that expertise and through sort of the forward deployed engineering roles, right, that are actively working together with our customers to configure our instances, set up these workflows, set up these agents and things like that, right? But that's really the way to think about it. People like to give these things a fancy name. I don't know that it's that different than what people were used to, but it certainly has been interesting development over, you can see across industries.
Yeah, I started my career on Wall Street, and I was convinced half of the language of Wall Street was just used to be a secret language to keep other people out.
Exactly.
Well, William, I appreciate having you on. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I mean, look, like I think this point around really thinking further than just the point solution, right? When you're thinking about AI is really, really important, right? Like there's a lot of people that sort of try to go this best of breed approach and try a bunch of different things. And this is here to stay, right? And I think if you want to be competitive going forward, like you just have to realize that you're going to need to make some bigger and bolder choices, right? It's very clear from our data and what we're seeing in the market that the only way to be successful is to go that path. And yeah, I think that's just an important takeaway for people listening.
All right, great. Well, William Steenbergen, co-founder and CTO of Federato, thanks so much for joining me on the InsurTech Leadership Podcast.
Thanks, Josh. Have a good one.